What if death was not the end? What if a man once walked so closely with God that the grave itself had no claim on him? The Bible records a mystery so brief, so understated, that countless readers pass over it without stopping to ask the obvious question: how can a human being escape the fate that has ruled over every generation? And more importantly, what does his story mean for us? In the ancient days, before the flood, before Abraham, before Moses and the law, there lived a man whose life became a prophecy. His name was Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam, the child of a world already falling into darkness, yet chosen for a destiny beyond human comprehension. Scripture tells us in Genesis 5 verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Just a single sentence. No explanation, no details, no farewell scene. Only the stunning reality that God himself removed Enoch from the earth without tasting death. But behind this simple statement lies a story filled with prophetic significance, hidden patterns, and warnings that stretch from the dawn of humanity all the way to the final judgment still to come. This is not just the biography of a man who lived thousands of years ago. It is a mirror held up to every generation, including our own. For if Enoch's walk with God was so powerful that it shook the course of history, then what might it reveal about the choices we face today? To grasp the weight of his life, we must journey back into the world of Genesis, a time when men lived for centuries, when families passed down stories not for decades, but for hundreds of years, when the memory of Eden was still whispered by those who had walked its paths. This was a world brimming with innovation, cities rising, knowledge spreading, but also poisoned by pride, violence, and rebellion against the Creator. A world that sounds strangely familiar to our own. Into this turbulent setting, Enoch was born. His very name, meaning dedicated, spoke of a destiny set apart. And while many around him lived as if God did not exist, Enoch chose a different path. His faith was not shallow ritual or tradition. It was living, breathing, intimate fellowship with the Almighty. He became the friend of God in a generation that had forgotten its maker. And here lies the great paradox. Enoch is remembered less for what he did and more for what he became. He did not build an ark like Noah, nor receive stone tablets like Moses, nor rule as a king like David. His legacy was far simpler, yet infinitely more profound. He walked with God, and that walk was enough to alter eternity. But the mystery only deepens. Why did God take Enoch? Why him and not another? And what secret message lies within his story that still calls out to us across the ages? To answer this, we must begin where all things begin, with the sacred line of Adam, and the hidden genealogy that carries more than history within its names. Every story in Scripture unfolds along the thread of a lineage, and the life of Enoch is no exception. To understand why his walk with God was so extraordinary, we must first trace the sacred genealogy that carried the light of faith through centuries of darkness. Genesis chapter 5 is often skipped over, dismissed as a dry list of names and ages. But hidden within those names is a coded testimony, a divine map pointing toward the destiny of humankind. After the tragedy of Abel's death, when Cain's jealousy spilled the first innocent blood, Adam and Eve were given another son. His name was Seth, which means appointed or granted. Eve declared, "God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed." This was more than consolation. It was the beginning of a holy line, chosen to preserve the memory of God in a world already sliding into corruption. From Seth came Enoch, whose name means mortal or frail, a reminder that humanity is dust and utterly dependent on the breath of the Almighty. Then came Canaan, meaning possession or acquired, pointing to the truth that life itself is a gift that belongs to God. After him was Mahalalel, the praise of God, whose very name rang like a hymn across generations, proclaiming that worship was at the heart of human purpose. Mahalalel fathered Jared, whose name means descent or to come down. By Jared's time, the world was visibly shifting. Civilization was advancing, but so was rebellion. Darkness was descending. And then, into that descent, Jared's son was born, Enoch, whose name means dedicated. Each of these names carried prophetic weight. Adam, meaning man, reminds us of our beginning. Seth, appointed, signals God's sovereign plan. Enoch, frail, reveals human weakness. Kenan, possession, shows God's ownership. Mahalalel, praise of God, calls humanity to worship. Jared, descent, points to the fall of man. And then comes Enoch, dedicated, the man who would walk with God in the midst of decline. When strung together, these names are not just history but prophecy. Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, teaching the dedicated ones. The genealogy reveals another mystery. The number 7, woven throughout Scripture, symbolizes completion and divine perfection. Enoch is the 7th generation from Adam. Just as the 7th day was set apart as holy, so too the 7th descendant was set apart for a holy purpose. This is no accident. The Spirit of God was already foreshadowing through numbers what he would later reveal through prophecy. And notice the lifespans. Adam lived 930 years, long enough to see 9 generations of his descendants. Seth lived 912 years, Enoch 905, Kenan 910, Mahalalel 895, Jared 962. These patriarchs were not just names, they were living archives. Imagine a great-grandfather speaking directly to his great-great-great-grandchildren about the Garden of Eden, the fall, and the promise of redemption. These men were human libraries of sacred memory. Each carried the knowledge of God across centuries, repeating the same stories so that no generation could claim ignorance of their Creator. Yet even as this faithful line preserved the flame of righteousness, the wider world was turning away. Violence increased, hearts grew proud, and idols began to rise. Against this backdrop of corruption, the genealogy shines like a golden thread woven through darkness. Each name whispers a promise. Each life testifies that God had not abandoned humanity, even as humanity was abandoning him. And then, after 6 generations of mortal men, the 7th arrives. Enoch, dedicated, set apart, chosen. The genealogy has reached its climax, and history is about to turn a page. But why was Enoch different? Why did his life stand out in a line of patriarchs who also knew the Lord? The answer lies not only in his name, but in the world into which he was born, a world both advanced and decaying, a mirror of our own. To understand Enoch's significance, we must step into his world, the ancient age between Eden and the flood, when human lifespan stretched nearly a millennium and civilization was rapidly expanding. It was a time both wondrous and terrifying, a world shimmering with human potential, yet corroded by rebellion against God. Enoch was born during the 7th generation from Adam, in the days when the memory of paradise had not yet faded. Adam himself still walked the earth. Imagine growing up in a world where the first man, formed by God's own hands, could still recount the fragrance of Eden, the sound of God's footsteps in the garden, and the tragedy of being cast out. These living testimonies made humanity's origin impossible to deny. Yet knowledge of God's glory did not prevent humanity's descent into corruption. Genesis gives us 2 genealogical lines, the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. The line of Cain, marked by rebellion, pursued city building, music, and metallurgy, achievements that revealed human genius but also fostered arrogance and violence. Lamech, Cain's descendant, boasted of murder and celebrated vengeance. Civilization was advancing, but so was depravity. On the other side stood the line of Seth, a lineage chosen to preserve the worship of the true God. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Genesis 4 verse 26. Yet even within this line, the pull of the surrounding culture was strong. The earth was filling with innovation and luxury, but also with cruelty, pride, and spiritual compromise. Enoch's world was one of contrasts. On one hand, humanity flourished. Agriculture developed, cities expanded, trade grew, and art blossomed. On the other, the shadow of sin darkened every accomplishment. Men who lived for centuries accumulated vast influence, and corruption spread like a stain. Violence became the rhythm of daily life. Ancient Jewish traditions even describe this age as one when angelic beings crossed boundaries, giving rise to spiritual rebellion and unnatural offspring, foreshadowing the flood of judgment to come. It was in this environment that Enoch chose his path. Surrounded by pride, he chose humility. While others built cities, he built a life of intimacy with God. While many exalted themselves, he exalted the Creator. While his generation sought pleasure and power, he sought the presence of the Almighty. We must not imagine Enoch's walk with God as easy. It was costly. To live differently in a world that celebrated sin meant standing apart, perhaps facing mockery, rejection, and isolation. Yet his devotion was unwavering. He was dedicated, true to the meaning of his name. His faith was not inherited tradition, but personal encounter. He did not merely know about God, he knew God. The significance of Enoch's time cannot be overstated. He lived during an age that foreshadowed our own. Jesus later declared, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." Matthew 24 verse 37. The violence, corruption, and rebellion of Enoch's world mirror the conditions of the last days. Just as Enoch walked faithfully with God while awaiting coming judgment, so believers today are called to live holy lives while anticipating the return of Christ. Thus, the world of Enoch serves both as a warning and an invitation. It warns us of the dangers of unchecked sin, of a society that forgets its creator, of civilizations that advance outwardly while decaying inwardly. But it also invites us into the possibility of walking with God even when the world walks the other way. Enoch's world was not so different from ours. And if he could live in fellowship with God amid such darkness, then so can we. His story is not just ancient history. It is a prophetic pattern for every generation that longs to remain faithful until the end. The heart of Enoch's story is captured in a single, breathtaking phrase: Enoch walked with God. Simple, yet unfathomable. These 4 words contain the weight of an entire life. They tell us nothing of his achievements, his possessions, or his influence. Instead, Scripture defines him solely by his fellowship with the Almighty. But what does it mean to walk with God? This phrase suggests more than occasional prayer or ritual observance. It implies intimacy, agreement, and constant companionship. Amos 3 verse 3 asks, "Can 2 walk together unless they are agreed?" To walk with God means to align one's heart with His, to live in step with His will, to journey through life not as an independent traveler, but as one accompanied by the Creator Himself. Enoch's walk was not a momentary experience, but a lifelong pursuit. Genesis tells us he lived 365 years, a symbolic number that mirrors the days of a solar year. His lifespan became a living parable of completeness and consistency. Just as the sun rises and sets without fail, Enoch's devotion was steady and enduring. Every season of his life was marked by communion with God. Unlike others in his generation, Enoch did not drift into compromise. He did not treat worship as a distant tradition, but as daily reality. His faith was not a belief system to be acknowledged, but a relationship to be lived. He conversed with God, listened for His voice, and ordered his steps according to His presence. In an age defined by rebellion, he embodied loyalty. Hebrews 11 verse 5 reveals the secret of his life. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Faith was the key. Not works, not rituals, not extraordinary accomplishments. Faith. Trust in God's character, confidence in His promises, surrender to His will. Faith turned Enoch's walk into worship. Every step was an act of devotion, every choice an altar, every breath a testimony. His life became a continuous offering of praise. And because of this, he pleased God. To please the Almighty is the highest calling of man, and Enoch achieved it not through greatness by the world's standards, but through daily, faithful fellowship. Consider the contrast. In his time, others sought to build legacies of power, cities of stone, monuments to human pride. Their names are remembered for violence, for rebellion, for sin. But Enoch, who left behind no empire, no invention, no earthly monument, is remembered eternally for something far greater. He walked with God. This truth shatters our modern illusions. In a world obsessed with achievement and recognition, Enoch reminds us that God values faithfulness above fame, intimacy above influence, character above crowns. His life calls us to reorient our priorities. What matters is not how much we accomplish in human terms, but whether we live in step with the eternal. Walking with God also means perseverance. It is not a single decision, but 1,000 daily choices. To rise in the morning and set one's heart on the Lord. To resist temptation when the world seduces. To speak truth when lies dominate. To live humbly when pride entices. Such a walk demands endurance, courage, and grace. Enoch exemplified this perseverance across centuries. Moreover, his walk was prophetic. Jude 14-15 records that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, "See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone." His intimacy with God gave him insight into the future, a vision of divine judgment and redemption. Enoch not only walked with God, he spoke for him. His faith produced testimony, his testimony produced prophecy, and his prophecy still echoes into the last days. In Enoch, we see the model of what it means to live close to God. It is not perfection in performance, but dedication in relationship. Not ritual, but reality. Not momentary fervor, but lifelong consistency. He walked with God until one day the walk simply did not end. Enoch's testimony stands as a challenge to every believer. Will we walk with God in a world that runs from him? Will we cultivate intimacy with the Almighty while others pursue vanity? Will our lives be defined not by fleeting achievements, but by eternal fellowship? This is the essence of Enoch's legacy. His walk with God was not just his story, it is an invitation. An invitation to you, to me, to every generation, to live by faith, to please God, to walk in step with him until the journey carries us beyond the limits of time into the presence of eternity. The life of Enoch was not only marked by intimacy with God, but also by prophetic vision. He did not merely walk in silent fellowship. He spoke, declaring truths that reached far beyond his own generation. His words, preserved in fragments throughout Scripture, reveal a man who saw the end from the beginning, who glimpsed both judgment and redemption. The clearest record of his prophecy comes from the short letter of Jude, one of the final books of the New Testament. Jude writes, "Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone, and to convict all of them of all the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness, and of all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him." Jude 14-15. This is extraordinary. The earliest prophet recorded in human history foresaw the ultimate judgment of God at the end of time. Long before Abraham, Moses, or Isaiah, Enoch proclaimed the coming of the Lord with his heavenly host. His prophecy was not about a local event, not about a temporary crisis, but about the final day when all humanity would stand before their Creator. The weight of this vision cannot be overstated. Enoch, who lived in a world spiraling toward the flood, spoke of a judgment far greater than water, the day when the Lord himself would descend with glory and power. He saw beyond his own time, beyond Noah's Ark, beyond the covenants of Israel, straight into the ultimate unveiling of Christ at the end of the age. How did Enoch, living so early in human history, see so far? The answer lies in his walk with God. Intimacy with the Almighty opens the eyes of the heart. The closer one walks with him, the more clearly one perceives his purposes. Enoch's fellowship gave him prophetic sight. He lived so near to God that he could glimpse what others could not imagine. But his prophecy was not only about judgment, it was also a warning and a call. Jude cites Enoch's words to expose the arrogance of false teachers and the corruption of sinners. Enoch's message rang across the centuries. God is not mocked. Every word, every deed, every secret act will be brought into the light. The Lord will come, and no one will escape his justice. This warning is timeless. It spoke to the violent generation before the flood, it confronted Israel's rebels, it challenged the early church, and it speaks to us today. We, too, live in days of moral decline, when sin is celebrated and righteousness mocked. Enoch's prophecy reminds us that divine judgment is not a myth, but a certainty. The same God who took Enoch without death will one day return with his holy ones to bring justice to the earth. Yet hidden within his words is also hope. For if God will judge the ungodly, he will also vindicate the righteous. The coming of the Lord is not only a day of terror, but also a day of triumph. Those who walk with God, as Enoch did, will not be condemned but welcomed. His prophecy, therefore, is both a warning and a promise, judgment for the rebellious, salvation for the faithful. Later traditions, such as the Book of Enoch, expand on his visions with detailed imagery of heavenly realms, fallen angels, and cosmic battles. While not part of the biblical canon, these writings reflect how deeply Enoch's testimony shaped ancient understanding of the unseen world. They portray him as a man who bridged heaven and earth, who entered the mysteries of God and returned to speak of them. Enoch's prophecy is a reminder that walking with God is not only personal but prophetic. To live near him is to become a witness of his truth. Every believer who follows Enoch's path is called not only to intimacy, but also to testimony, to speak of the coming king and to live as though his return is near. Thus Enoch stands as both example and prophet, an example of faith that pleases God, and a prophet whose vision pierced the veil of time. His life declares that those who walk with the Almighty will see further, speak clearer, and shine brighter in a world shrouded by darkness. When the story of Enoch reaches its climax, it does so with a silence that is deafening. Genesis 5 verse 24 simply states, "Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him." Just 7 words in the Hebrew text, yet those words carry a mystery that has echoed for millennia. What does it mean that God took him? There is no mention of illness, no detail of a funeral, no grave that could become a shrine for future generations. Enoch's story ends not with mourning but with vanishing, and that absence itself becomes his testimony. The brevity of the passage forces us to pause. The inspired record does not explain the mechanics, does not describe heavenly chariots or angelic escorts. Instead, it leaves us with the simplicity of faith. God took him. And in that simplicity lies the mystery. For all of human history up to that point, death had been the great equalizer. Adam, the father of humanity, had returned to the dust. Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, each lived long and then died. But Enoch's name is followed not by the refrain, "and he died," but by an interruption in the cycle. He was no more. Imagine the shock of his family and community. Day after day, they saw Enoch rise early, withdraw into prayer, return with eyes burning with otherworldly conviction. Then one day, he did not come back. Was he walking a familiar path when heaven opened before him? Did he step into the unseen realm as easily as one crosses the threshold of a doorway? Scripture does not say, but the effect was undeniable. The man who had warned of judgment, who had spoken of the Lord's coming with thousands of his saints, had himself become a sign that life is not bound by death. The writer of Hebrews interprets this moment with a clarity that Genesis leaves hidden. Hebrews 11 verse 5 tells us, "By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God." Here the mystery is revealed not as a trick of fate, but as the fruit of faith. Enoch's life of intimate fellowship was so pleasing to God that translation became the natural conclusion. He had walked so closely with heaven that when the time came, heaven simply absorbed him. For believers today, Enoch's translation is not just a curiosity, it is a prophecy in itself. It foreshadows the promise given in 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 17, that those who are alive at the Lord's return will be caught up to meet him in the air. Enoch's life becomes a preview of the ultimate hope of the faithful, that death is not the final word, that fellowship with God extends beyond the grave, and that the Creator has the power to draw his children into his presence in an instant. But Enoch's translation is also a warning. It reminds us that only those who walk with God can share in this destiny. His disappearance was not random, nor was it earned through works of human strength. It was the outcome of a relationship. His translation testifies that communion with God is not a distant dream, but a present reality, and that such communion changes everything. Even today, Enoch's absence speaks. His missing grave challenges the wisdom of the world. His story whispers through history that another realm is closer than we think, and that one day, as Paul wrote, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the boundary between mortality and eternity may vanish. Enoch's life ends without an ending. But his story continues to speak. He shows us that faith is not a theory, not a ritual, but a walk. Day by day, step by step, his choice to seek God above all else brought him into such harmony with the divine that death itself could not touch him. That is why his testimony still matters. He reminds us that the measure of a life is not how long it lasts, but how closely it aligns with the heart of the Creator. Think of what his neighbors must have felt. At first, confusion, then awe, and finally, a trembling awareness that the words he had preached were true. God had stamped his approval upon Enoch's message in the most dramatic way possible. And so the man who walked with God became a sign to every generation. That fellowship with the Almighty is not only real, it is eternal. What does this mean for us today? We live in an age of distraction, where the noise of the world drowns out the still small voice of God. Yet Enoch's example invites us to rediscover the simplicity of devotion, to rise each day with a heart open to heaven, to see prayer not as duty, but as breath, to recognize that walking with God is not the privilege of the few, but the calling of all who believe. Enoch's translation was more than an escape from death. It was a promise that those who walk with God will never walk alone. And it was a prophecy that one day, those who remain faithful will also be taken into the presence of the Lord, never to be separated again. If this story has stirred something within you, do not let it end here. Explore the next chapter of this mystery with us, and let Enoch's testimony lead you deeper into the hope of eternity.